I'm actually at Douglas County Extension today. I was away for a Master Naturalist class. Typically, these Houseplant Academy classes or webinars, if you've not been to one before, they are typically a hybrid workshop where we have some hands-on in-person lessons at our office, and then we have the online version. But today, since I'm not in Gwinnett, we are doing strictly virtual. And just so you know, you will be able to watch this recording at a later date if there's something that you want to go back and review, or you would like to just review, whatever we're discussing. So I have Lisa Klein with me today. She is our moderator, and she will be monitoring the chat and admitting people from the waiting room. So if you have any questions as I go, please just type them into the chat, and then at the end, she will let me know, what questions we have available to answer. Also, we are aware that there's a bit of a gray bar issue going on. I apologize for that in advance. Hopefully you can still see my pretty pictures I put on here of the orchids. It's a little bit of a settings issue that we hope to have ironed out by the next webinar, but just bear with us for now. So anyway, getting into Houseplant Academy, All About Orchids. This was probably my #1 most requested topic to discuss for Houseplant Academy. I started the program last year with about 6, maybe 8 classes. I can't remember how many we did that first run. And I asked members and viewers what they would like to see me cover. And overwhelmingly, it was orchids. So we are going to get right into that. What I've learned about orchids is probably that there's much more than I could possibly ever know. But that's the exciting thing about horticulture. So before we get into the actual care and feeding of an orchid, I want to talk a little bit about the history of orchids, because right now, you can find an orchid really anywhere and they're quite affordable. Go to any Publix, Kroger, Walmart, Lowe's, Home Depot, or just your regular neighborhood nursery, and you'll find a reasonably priced orchid to get your hands on. But it wasn't always that way. There was something called orchidomania, and it began in 1823 with the flowering of the Queen of Orchids, which is the Cattleya, and its Latin name is Cattleya labiate. William Catley is the person who the flower was named for. He was a plant collector near London, and he received a shipment of plants from William John Swainson, who was a plant explorer in northeastern Brazil. Now, keep in mind, at this point in the 1800s, orchids were not a common or popular thing. They were extremely rare. A lot of them had yet to be discovered. So included in this batch of plants was what we now know as the Cattleya orchid, as I said, named for William Catley. A drawing of that blooming Cattleya that he received in that batch of plants caused the public to go mad. And so if you look over to the right of your screen, this is the drawing. They recorded the plants that he received on things called plates with drawings of whatever they had. It was the only one he received. And it was another 65 years before another specimen of Cattleya was found. But just people seeing this picture of this Cattleya that was discovered in 1823 set people on a mad craze to search for more orchids. And it became a big status symbol among wealthy people. Only the extremely wealthy could afford to have a greenhouse. Only the extremely wealthy could afford to drop that kind of money on a rare and exclusive plant that had to be, shipped from around the world. And only the extremely wealthy could afford to lose the plant, because that's what ended up typically happening. Most of those orchids died because the greenhouses were too hot. People didn't know how to take care of them. But just being able to be so frivolous with your money, I guess, was another sign of your wealth. So this picture really stood out to me when I was doing some research on this. This is thousands of orchids that were harvested from their natural habitats during orchidomania. People went crazy trying to get orchids and finding them and discovering them. And a lot of the natural habitat was just ravaged. And that's why so many orchids are endangered today, because people over-farmed or over-poached, if you will. So orchids remain costly and rare because propagation was very slow and difficult to do. You think about it, if you want to sell a plant at a nursery or a big box store, you need to be able to produce a lot of plants at a reasonable cost and do it in a reasonably quick fashion without too many issues of disease or loss of plants, and they just couldn't do that at that point. It wasn't until the early 1920s when Lewis C. Knudsen of Cornell discovered a more relatively simple process of growing those thousands of seedlings under sterile conditions, but it was still expensive. It was still very difficult and painstaking. But then in the 1960s, a technique called cloning was developed, and this allowed for people to produce large quantities of these orchids by taking tissue from the meristem of the plant and dividing it in a lab setting. So now, as I said, we can go to Lowe's or Home Depot or your local nursery and find an orchid that would have cost several $100s back then for $20 or not much more. And before, again, we get into the care and feeding of orchids, I also wanted to point out, I recommend this book for you. If you find the history of orchidomania interesting, if you like any of that sort of true history, true crime, this is a great book. It's the true story of the arrest of plant dealer John LaRoche and 3 Seminole men who stole rare ghost orchids, which they poached from a wild swamp in Florida. It's called The Orchid Thief by Susan Orlean. It was later made into a movie starring Nicolas Cage. I highly recommend the book if you like that kind of genre. Okay. So getting into the queen orchid, Cattleya, it's also known as the corsage orchid, the cat orchid. It likes high light, east, south, or west windows are appropriate. Now you'll notice I'm going to cover approximately 6 different types of orchids, and you'll notice that a lot of them have very similar requirements, but a couple of them are a little bit different, so you do need to pay attention to that. They're not all identical. They like temperatures between 60 and 85 degrees. They like to dry out between watering. So keep in mind, not all orchids are that way. Some of them like to stay moist consistently. So make sure if you purchase an orchid, you know what kind it is and you're paying attention to its particular needs. So water for 15 seconds with lukewarm, non-softened water every 7 days approximately. And I'll put an asterisk by that statement because it's really impossible to give just a blanket prescription of how often you should water a plant because it is so situational, so objective, depending on the environment. So how often you water your orchid not only depends on the type of orchid that you have, but the humidity in your home. If you're growing it just in your windowsill, if you have it in a terrarium or little greenhouse setting, all of these things affect the temperature, they affect the humidity, and it will really depend on that. So I say every 7 days approximately. That's a good rule of thumb at first, but then keep an eye on your orchid when you first get it. Check it out, see how it's doing, and then change course if you need to. Also, please do not use ice cubes to water your orchid. This is a big myth, and even in researching this topic, there are still websites that say, yes, you can water your orchids with ice cubes. It's perfectly fine, and people have done it. It's just not advised. If you think about it, orchids grow in humid, warm, temperate environments. They don't like the ice cold. The ice can damage the orchid, so they really want some lukewarm water and more of a tropical approach to their care. So always allow the water to drain from the bottom of the pot, even though they like a lot of humidity and moisture. Going overboard on that can cause root rot, just like with any other plant. So the humidity should remain around 50 to 80%, and you can easily accomplish that with a humidifier, or you could put it in a case or a cabinet at your home. Use a general 20-20-20 fertilizer at 25% of the recommended rate. And a lot of orchid enthusiasts like to call it water weekly. So W-E-A-K, W-E-E-K. So dilute that general fertilizer every week and give it to your orchid. Or you could use an orchid fertilizer. It's not always necessary to use an orchid-specific fertilizer. I want to make that point. You can just use a general 20-20-20. So once a month in spring and summer, once a week in spring and summer, and then once a month in fall and winter for the Cattleya. And then once the flowers start to wilt, use clean scissors to cut the stem down to the leaf close to that pseudobulb. and we'll get into what a pseudobulb is a little bit later. Repot every 2 years, or if the plant outgrows its container. And you can see this lovely hybrid over here, this little pink and white spotted. There are so many different varieties and colors. What is a pseudobulb on an orchid, and why do you need to know? So some orchids have pseudobulbs and some do not. And why you need to know this is because if you're looking up how to care for your orchid, oftentimes the care instructions online in an extension publication, or possibly you're looking at the American Orchid Society, they will reference the pseudobulb. So you need to know what that is. They're structures that orchids use to store nutrients, water, air, and food. And on the left here, you see those are the pseudobulbs that are coming kind of laterally above the roots. And then to the right, you can see kind of like a, how do I describe that? We have Catalea and Dendrobium here, and it's really just like a tubular growth. It's not a bulb, but it's similar to that. Here's the Cymbidium, aka the boat orchid. It likes highlight, so east, south, or west windows are appropriate. Very rarely will you hear me ever tell you to put a plant in a north-facing window if it's a tropical plant like that. Of course, ferns would be the exception, but orchids do not want that low light. So temperatures between 50 and 85. If you take your orchid outside for the spring and summer, which I highly encourage you to do, when temperatures start to dip below 50, you need to bring it in. Water for approximately 15 seconds, like we say, with lukewarm water. Non-softened water is important too. Allow that water to drain out every time you water, and then reduce your watering in the winter to once every 10 days approximately. So that's going to be dependent on the humidity and the conditions in your home, and again, how you're growing it, whether you're putting it in a terrarium or a little mini greenhouse in your house or just in your windowsill, and it likes that 50% humidity. Now, most of us do not have 50% humidity in our homes. So a humidifier or just something that you can do like a little cabinet or a cloche would go a long way to increasing that humidity. Some people have windows in their bathroom, which is really nice. You can get that humidity there just by having it in the bathroom when your family's taking their showers. It can really, really assist with that. So using a slow release 20-20-20 fertilizer, again, weekly at 25% the recommended rate, diluted in that 1 gallon of water. Add fertilizer twice a week in spring and summer, and once a month in fall and winter. So you'll notice that is different than what we suggested for Catalea, which is why you do need to look at the particular type of orchid you're growing and what its particular needs are. And similar to Catalea, once those flowers start to wilt, use clean scissors to cut the stem down to its base. Now, I know a lot of us, when we're cutting and clipping and cleaning up our plants with scissors or pruners, we don't always clean in between. But when you're doing this with an orchid on the roots, it's just a good idea to make sure that your scissors or your pruners are sterilized first with a little rubbing alcohol. It'll save you time later on with possible fungicide or fungus spread. So repot every 2 to 3 years, or if the plant outgrows its container. Use some orchid bark, which you can purchase, or you can make your own mixture. So this one requires 2 parts of a fine bark, 1 part of a coarse bark, and 1 part perlite. Keep 1 to 2 pseudobulbs per growth. Now, I would say unless you're really comfortable sourcing those ingredients and making your own mixture, I would just buy the ready-made orchid bark to save yourself some headache. If you're more of a houseplant or a plant expert or intermediate, you can go ahead and make your own, but sometimes it's easier just to buy the prepackaged mix and make it easy on yourself. Dendrobium is so beautiful. I love this orchid. It's got such a unique look. Provide high light levels, east, south, or west facing windows. It likes 60 to 80, so you'll notice that's a contrast from the one we just reviewed. It needs a little bit warmer temperatures for that base temperature. So when nighttime temperatures go below 60, it has to come inside. It likes to dry out between waterings. Same watering situation, water for approximately 15 seconds with that lukewarm water. Make sure you're not using softened water. Don't water with ice cubes. It does not like that. Allow that water to drain out of the bottom of the pot. And it likes humidity 50 to 80. So this one needs a little bit more humidity than the previous orchid we discussed. So again, paying attention to those individual characteristics and needs of your orchids. So a small humidifier or enclosing in a terrarium, those are really good things you can do to help with the humidity issue. Don't allow your roots to sit in water though. They don't want to become waterlogged. They need that sweet spot of humidity without being waterlogged, like I said. You can fertilize with a general 20-20-20 fertilizer, diluted, of course, once a week in spring and summer and once a month in fall and winter, cutting back that stem to the pseudobulb after those flowers wilt. Repot every 2 years and plant it in some commercial orchid bark. Or if you want to make your own mixture, you'll notice this recipe that I have on here for an orchid bark for the dendrobium is different than the previous orchid. So you have to pay attention to that. It likes 2 parts medium bark, 1 part coarse bark, 1 part perlite, and 1 part medium charcoal. And I'd like to mention also that when you're buying orchid bark, whether you're going into a store or a nursery or buying, say, online like in Amazon, the individual orchid bark will list on the bag or on the package what types of orchids it's best suited for. So, one may be more suited for dendrobium, one may be more suited for phalaenopsis. Many of them can be used for multiple types of orchids. Just make sure that you look. It's really not that complicated. Maybe the way I'm describing it makes it sound a little complicated, but really it's not. It's just like buying soil for succulents versus buying soil for, your ferns. You want to get a different formula, but read the package and you'll be fine. Oncidium is also known as dancing lady and butterfly, and you can kind of see why the little flowers look like dancing ladies. They're very pretty and very delicate. They like moderate to highlight levels, so your east, west, or south facing windows. They don't want to go below 60 degrees. They like the same type of watering approach, but they like to be kept damp. So when we say keep the substrate damp, we mean the potting media, whether you have it in sphagnum or orchid bark or whatever, it needs to be moist all the time. But let that water drain out of the bottom. You don't want to encourage root rot. And this one likes 40 to 70% humidity. So again, humidifier, terrarium, or a plant cabinet. It likes to be fertilized at 25% the recommended rate, just like the others, once a week in spring and summer, and once a month in fall and winter. And then you want to prune those once those flowers start to wilt and the stem turns brown. And always keep your scissors clean when you're doing this. It doesn't have to be pruned very often because these orchids have a very long bloom time. So having to clean the scissors between cutting them back shouldn't be too much of a chore. Repot every 2 years approximately. And then this one likes the 2 parts medium bark, 1 part small bark, 1 part perlite, and 1 part fine charcoal if you desire to create your own mix. And if you do not, just purchase some commercial orchid bark that is listed for Oncidium care. So Paphiopedilum, known as the Venus slipper, this one actually needs low light. So place them several feet from your east, south, or west facing windows. You'll notice this is a very different recommendation than we have for all the other orchids. So again, important to figure out what your individual orchid needs. It wants a lower light interface. So water approximately the same way every 5 days. Water before that substrate dries out completely, so it likes to stay moist, just like the previous orchid did. Doesn't want you using ice cubes because, again, it didn't grow in the Arctic. It grew, probably in a greenhouse, but originally grew in the tropics. Allow that water to drain out of the bottom of the pot every time you water, and keep those humidity levels between 50 and 70%. Pretty difficult to achieve in your house in the wintertime if you're not using something like a humidifier or terrarium or cabinet. Some people like to put a tray of pebbles with some water. It's not one of my favorite methods because for me, it tends to encourage fungus gnats, but some people do that and they have great success and they're happy with that. So whatever works for you. Now, the Phalaenopsis moth orchid is probably the most common and most popular orchid that people have in their homes, receive as gifts, have questions about. This one needs moderate light, so keep it several feet from an east-facing window. It likes between 70 and 85, so we've had some nights that were cooler than that for sure recently, so you would have wanted to bring your moth orchid in by now at this point. It wants to be watered for approximately 15 seconds with that lukewarm water. Water needs to be non-softened. In the wintertime, reduce the watering to roughly every 2 to 10 days. Please don't water with ice cubes and maintain 50 to 80% humidity. Now, some of you may say, well, I have a moth orchid and I know it's not getting that much humidity and it still blooms. And that's great. Wonderful if you're giving it what it needs or if it's happy, don't worry about it. Plants don't read books. They don't have a humidity, monitor next to themselves saying, oh, we went below 50. I'm going to go ahead and peter out. Some people have luck in their homes with it getting below that. But if you want to give your plant truly what it wants and what it needs, if you're having an issue with your plant, it's not thriving, come look at this list, look at what it wants and give it that. Fertilize with a general 20-20-20 at 25% of the recommended rate, once a week in spring and summer, and once a month in fall and winter. So when those flowers start to wilt, use clean shears to cut the stem just above the closest two nodes, repot every 2 years, and use a commercial orchid bark. And again, for this one, you can make your own. It's not terribly difficult. You just want to make sure that you have the supplies you need: small bark, perlite, and charcoal. And I have done this. I have made my own bark before. It's again not difficult once you have a little recipe to follow. And you can typically, it may be difficult when you go to make your purchase. Well, how do I know what's a small bark? And how do I know what the coarse bark is? If you're purchasing online, I find that that's a lot easier because you can be very specific in putting in that search engine, a coarse bark for orchid or a small bark for orchid. It'll tell you exactly what it is. Or, going to a website such as an extension website and putting in orchids, orchid care, or the American Orchid Society, they can be very specific in helping you choose what you may want to purchase. Now, the Vanda orchid is probably my favorite just because it has a special place for me, because when I first saw this several years ago, I walked into a grocery store and there were several of these Vanda orchids just hanging from the ceiling around the floral department. And it was so striking. I had never seen any kind of orchid or plant growing like that with its roots just dangling out. And I guess the way, sometimes you just remember the first time you saw a really beautiful flower or you were really impressed by a flower and it just looked so exotic and luxurious, and I had to have it, of course. So I purchased it. And they are a little bit, they're definitely different as far as their care needs. And I learned to make the Vanda happy with some trial and error. So if you're growing this Vanda orchid indoors, they like extended bright to very bright light to remain healthy and floriferous. I put mine outside in spring and summer because and I keep it in shade, of course, not in the scalding sun. But they need that light for sure, and it makes life much easier on me because I do not have an indoor plant cabinet at this time. I do not have an indoor terrarium that's large enough for the Vanda, and I don't have a great place in my bathroom where I would trust that it would get enough humidity and moisture. So putting the Vanda outside, I can just take that hose every day and spray it, and I know that it's getting the moisture, the consistent moisture that it needs. So dappled sunlight, you don't want to put it in the bright sun outdoors because that would really dry it out. So in Georgia, late spring, summer, and early fall, they're sometimes considered high maintenance because of their high demand for humidity. And I visited a couple of orchid nurseries when we first moved to Georgia. One, I want to say, was Rainbow Orchids. Another was Peach State Orchids. Very interesting. They had all kinds of really amazing specimens and, a lot of hard to find collectible type things that were just fun to look at. But I bring that up to say, one of the proprietors of one of those orchid nurseries told me that they used to carry Vandas, but they found that it was difficult even for them to keep up with them on a large scale because they did need that regular misting multiple times a day. They were in a greenhouse. The roots were exposed, and in that setting, they were drying out too quickly. So I don't know. I kind of thought, gosh, if an orchid grower, on this scale has a difficult time, what am I doing buying this for my house? But I'm telling you, I've had the same one for years and it's still thriving. So it can be done. So they can be planted in lava rock or horse bark, but they do best in open baskets, and I think they look the best that way. I think it's I love having this thing hanging. I have it hanging from one of those ladder planters, if you know what that is, like a ladder that just suspends from the ceiling. And it looks so exotic and fun and horticultural. Really nice. On those hot summer dry days, they may need watering more than once. So if you're not up for that, maybe you don't want to consider the Vanda. But even if you just have it for a season, I recommend it just for the experience. Sometimes if we're having a really crazy hot dry time, I will go give it a spray of the hose twice in a day. But I can tell you when I'm at work, I don't have time for that, and it's still living. So don't be scared off, even if all this does kind of put you off. Do not trim those healthy roots. So those roots, sometimes we can trim healthy roots of plants to get them to fit into a certain pot or to get them to be more under control. They do not want to be trimmed. Some of them are fragrant, so when you're purchasing a Vanda, note the individual plant tags when you purchase them. It's really nice when you can get a fragrant flowering Vanda. And this was a picture I found from a Vanda nursery. I thought it was so striking, and it really shows you how just exciting the plant can be. Really different experience of growing orchids for sure. So they grow upright from a single stem and they produce new leaves every year. And this is one, it looks like they have it in some sort of basket, but it's outside. Of course, it's an epiphyte, which means it grows in little nooks and crannies of trees and rocks and things in nature. They like quick, wet, dry cycles. So they want to be wet, but then they want to be dry. They want to be, they're a little fussy in that way. But again, I'm telling you, under my patio that doesn't get, absolute perfect care, they're still thriving. They like that general 20-20-20 fertilizer when they're actively growing. Use it at half or quarter strength. Reduce the fertilization in fall and cease in winter. Now, keep in mind that's a little bit of a different recommendation than what I've given you for the other orchids. So, just a reminder to pay attention to the particular type of orchid that you have when you're looking at care tips. And if you're not growing it in a media, which I do not, I let mine just hang in the basket. It's beneficial to soak it in a solution of 1 tablespoon of, I meant to write in there, Epsom salt per gallon of water for a few hours every month, because whenever they lose too many salts, this Vanda is a little bit prone to that. They'll just remain wrinkled no matter how much water you give them. So if you end up with a Vanda that looks really wrinkled, but it's not dead and it's not sick necessarily, it's probably just that it's lost too much salt. So soak it, give it a nice Epsom soak, just like you would yourself with some achy joints, and it'll be happy again. So talking about watering your orchid, it's really not complicated. It's not to overthink it. Most of these slides I suggested watering lukewarm water for 15 seconds, and that's just a general guideline. Your orchid's not going to just suddenly wilt if you stop watering at 14 seconds or if you go over to 19 seconds. It's not that sort of thing. It's just meant to give you a general guideline. They like to be watered overhead in your sink. If you can't do that, you can't do that, and so be it. But if you can pick up your orchid and take it to your sink or your shower and let it have that overhead spray, what you're really doing is you're mimicking what it's like in nature whenever it's out in the rain, in the rainforest, and it allows the water to run right off of the roots and not sit in there because you have holes in your pot. Also rinses off dust, and having that water coat over the flowers and the leaves also increases humidity because you're not drying it off when you're done. So most orchids need watering approximately every 5 to 12 days, and it really is going to depend, as I said, on your indoor home environment. Everybody's house is a little different. We've all been in houses where we think, gosh, it's a little muggy in here. And then some people's houses you go and it's super dry like the desert. So just depends on what your personal comfort level is in your home. It depends on that. And signs that your orchid need to be watered include the growing mix is dry to the touch. So, some orchids, obviously, like the Vanda, are not in media. But if it feels dry, okay, that's a clue that maybe I need to water this thing. Or if the plant is light in weight. But for me, I like to go by this last one. The leaves and roots are pale in color. You don't want them to be super pale. What you'll notice that whenever you put your orchid, if you're lucky enough to be able to put it under a shower or under your sink sprayer, you'll see how nice and green and plump and just juicy those roots look after they've been watered. So then when they go all the way to being really pale, you'll be able to tell that difference and say, oh, this thing needs to take up some water. So as far as orchid fertilizers, most of the recommendations said just use a general purpose, and you absolutely can. However, there are orchid fertilizers that you can use, and some of these, you might try different ones and kind of see which ones you like. I've had great luck with the three that I've got here. The Miracle Grow Orchid Plant Food Mist. I love getting just to spray the roots and spray the leaves and be done with it and not have to worry about mixing it up. I also like this, the Grow Company in the middle. It's also good if you have air plants or like a staghorn fern. I have some of those and I use it on all of those different plants. It's great. And then just these little pellets, the Repot Me brand, the slow release that are really good. If you would like to dilute that in water, that's a good option as well. So it's going to be some trial and error. I know I have so many plants. I can't spend a whole lot of time fussing. The spray is just great for me. So as I said, watering your orchid at the sink, you want your water to be lukewarm. You want it under a steady stream of water, and you want to consider purified water or reverse osmosis if your tap water is high in salt. Now, I've never had that problem, but if you do, if you know that's a really big issue, if you're having problems with your orchid, that's something to look at. Approximately 15 seconds, like we said, letting the water run through the potting mix and drain out the bottom. Please never use ice cubes just because, your orchid did not grow in the Antarctica. It wants to be something somewhere that's warm. And we mentioned the watering again, even though we just went over it. It's always important to water your orchids before you fertilize them because you don't want to apply fertilizer on top of dry roots and dry leaves. It's not going to be absorbed. The plant will be stressed. If you have watered it or if it's moist, then it can take up the fertilizer. So watering first, then fertilizing is the best thing to do. Adding it in spring and summer is typically for all orchids. They want that. Some of the orchids, as you know from me reviewing them, some of them want to be watered a little less in winter and fall, and some want to be, fertilized a little bit less in fall and winter, and some don't want to be fertilized at all in fall and winter. So if you're fertilizing in spring and summer, you know you're doing the right thing. They all want that. Weekly, so 20 fertilizer at 25% the recommended rate. And I will note that is if you're using a general purpose or all-purpose fertilizer. These orchid fertilizers that I have, I'm just following the instructions on the label. So those two sprays, after I water the orchid, I give it a spritz maybe once a week, and that's all I do. I don't have to worry about diluting those sprays. I don't have to worry about diluting those crystals, the Repot Me brand that I mentioned up here on the right. I just follow the instructions on the label. Though diluting and titrating down rather the fertilizer to 25% is something you do with a general purpose fertilizer. So, as I said, after watering with plain water, then you'll use your diluted fertilizer and allow the water to finish draining out of the bottom of the pot because you don't want the roots to rot. So when you're repotting your orchid, consider repotting when the orchid is showing signs of new growth. That's always a good time to do it. Use unglazed pots with at least one drainage hole. You want that water to drain out, and you also want those drainage holes so that they can get the humidity that's surrounding the pot. Plants should be snug inside the pot. You don't want to overpot. You don't want your roots to be floating around this big sea of orchid bark. You want them to be snug and a little tight. Purchase orchid bark media or make your own. So you'll remove the orchid from its old pot, and you're going to remove all that stuff that's stuck on there. So the bark, the moss, any other media, take it all off. Because whenever you take it out of the media, you're still going to have some stuck between those roots, stuck on top of them. Clean the whole thing, rinse it under the tap, and just get it fresh. Then use your sterilized scissors to cut away any withered leaves, old flower stalks, or unhealthy roots. Unhealthy roots are going to be those that are just, brown or black or just obviously withered and dead. Get rid of those. And inspect your plant closely for signs of pest or disease. That's always a great time to do it because if you catch that when you're repotting, you can go ahead and treat your plant at that time. So place the orchid in a new pot and center that orchid in its new pot and begin to add the potting media. So you're going to set that plant in the pot before you put any soil or not soil, orchid bark rather, in there. And make sure it's evenly distributed around all the sides and under the orchid. Press down firmly on that soil until you hear a light crunch, and you will hear that little crunch. Then you want to bring your orchid to the sink and water. That'll help anchor the newly planted orchid. Return the orchid to where it was and allow it to dry out, usually for approximately 2 weeks right after that repotting period, because you're going to get it much wetter than you normally would just on a regular watering that you would do, say, every week or two. When you repot it, everything is getting rinsed, everything's getting wetted down, so it's going to maintain its moisture for longer than normal. So let's go over some common pests of orchids. Now, knock wood, I have not had these issues with my orchids, thank God. My issues have typically been related to light, maybe having too much or not enough, or maybe not having my watering right. But pests are a thing. I'm sure now that I've said it, I've just jinxed myself. So mealybugs, we probably all know those from our houseplants. White cotton-like insects with small oval-shaped bodies. They're often found between those leaves and stems. They leave white stains on the leaves and sooty mold, and they reduce the plant vigor over time. Two things that can be done. Peppermint spray. So many of you have probably seen in my previous Houseplant Academy where I've recommended the peppermint Castile soap, Castile spray. You can make your own spray out of that. You can purchase that online. They don't like the mint and they don't like the thick oil of it. So you can spray the plant with that peppermint soap mixture and then use a cotton ball or toothbrush to wipe away those insects. Or you can take rubbing alcohol, about 10% of that, add it to water and remove the pest with the cotton ball. Now, I like to try to go through and remove as much of those pests before I rinse and then treat, but it's strictly your personal preference. It's all going to work. But when it comes to mealybugs, you've got to stay on top of those. It's not a one and done scenario. You treat for mealybugs this week, you're probably going to have to keep treating them for a while until it's gone. Scale can be difficult to detect. Those females look like brown growths on a plant surface. I actually have some scale on my pregnant onion that I have in my office right now, which is unfortunate. The waxy coating makes them resistant to many pesticides. So just spraying them with a coating of pesticide, they may not care because they're protected by their little coating. They have sticky mold, sooty mold, sticky honeydew, ants, and discoloration are all signs of scale. And we have the same method, the peppermint soap, spraying with the peppermint soap mixture. So it's the peppermint soap with the water, or also the rubbing alcohol. Those are two things you want to do. And again, not a one and done practice. You'll have to do that multiple times. Thrips, really terrible. I hope you never get those. They're very difficult to see with the naked eye. That top picture, you can kind of see a couple little spots, but in that bottom picture, you see that spotting and streaking in the leaves called stippling, damaged flowers, or stunted growth. Again, peppermint soap or rubbing alcohol, both good methods for that. But sometimes if you get a really bad infestation and it's a threat to your other plants, sometimes it's best just to bag it up and throw it away, to be honest with you, in the case of thrips. Aphids are those green and black insects that form colonies on new growth, leaf undersides, and flowers, and the damage can be similar to that of thrips. And they produce a sticky substance. Probably if you've ever had aphids, you know what I'm talking about when you kind of feel that and you can see that present. Peppermint and rubbing alcohol, two really good methods of addressing that and just staying on top of your plants. When I say staying on top of them, I mean look at them regularly. Don't let a month go by or multiple weeks go by without really inspecting your plant, because if you can catch something early on, you'll be in much better shape. And if you see something, you want to isolate that plant from your other ones. So if you let aphids or scale or something go for a while on one plant and it's near others, you'll have a full-blown house infestation, and you don't want that. So some orchid potting materials. Here's just a picture of some orchid bark. And then we have a nice pot with some holes in it. And then I'm showing these little plastic liners, the little cash pots that I put inside the bigger pot. I really like to plant all of my orchids in these little plastic containers with the slits, and you can buy them in multi-packs on Amazon and I'm sure other websites. But it makes it so easy. If you have a heavy pot or a really nice pot and you don't want to move that pot all around your house, it's so easy just to pick up that little plastic pot, take it out of the nicer pot, take it to your sink. It's lightweight. It can fall over in the sink. It's not going to cause a big issue. It's not heavy. It's so convenient for really giving your orchid a good soak, in my opinion. So we're going to go over some of the common questions I get about orchid problems people have, and hopefully this addresses some of your own issues. And if not, please feel free to put a question in the chat and we can talk about it. So orchid problem number one, my orchid has some yellow leaves. Is it dying? What should I do? Well, just so you know, yellow leaves are common and they're not necessarily indicative of a problem. When the orchid grows new leaves, it's common for the older leaves to turn yellow and die off, just like with many plants. Just simply snip them off with clean shears and you're fine. The Phalaenopsis orchids, the moth orchid, if they're raised in a humid greenhouse and then moved to your dry indoor environment, you may lose some leaves, and that's perfectly normal. You might see some leaves turning yellow pretty quickly, but that doesn't mean that the orchid's dying. It's just adjusting. It's going through a bit of shock. Make sure you stay on top of that moisture and give it what it wants. Cut off those yellow leaves, and it should be fine. When they're accompanied by dark, slimy spots, that's when you're worried. So a fungicide such as Physan 20 can be applied. You want to make sure you remove any damaged or slimy or fungus infected parts of your plant, isolate that plant and get it treated immediately. And make sure you always sterilize your tools. So if you're using tools such as shears or scissors or pruners to take care of the fungus on your plant, you definitely want them to be clean before you move on to take care of another plant. So orchid problem number two, my orchid's leaves look healthy, but it hasn't flowered in a year. How do I get it to flower again? So this is a very, very common issue with people. They say, my orchid looks so healthy. It looks green and pretty, but it doesn't flower. So there are four main factors to consider, and light is typically the most common reason why an orchid doesn't rebloom. So if the leaves are dark green in color, that can be an indication of insufficient light. Try moving that orchid to a south or east facing window or using artificial light. I think most of us think a nice dark green leaf is indicative of health, and typically it is. But when it comes to an orchid, they need a more of a medium green, grassy green color. And that dark green could mean that they're just not getting enough light. So fertilize weekly, as it says here, during spring and summer, even if it's getting really great light. If it's not getting fertilizer, it needs that food to put out those flowers. So definitely fertilize. Some species require a certain day length of flower, so that's not all that common. I don't really typically ever run into that as an issue for people who call me about their orchids, but it is one of the things that you can consider. And then a lot of them require a temperature change. So when the seasonal cooler temps turn in fall, when things get cooler, a lot of orchids flower in winter because they're cued by that temperature. So orchid problem number three, I put my orchid outside in the sun and now it has spots on the leaves. Okay, so I always recommend moving your orchids outdoors because houseplants in general, they just love, they love being outdoors and they love the humidity and the light, but you have to be careful about it. Be careful when you move your orchids to different light conditions, especially when you move them outdoors from the inside, because they are not used to that intense sunlight. Even if an orchid eventually should end up in a really sunny location, if it's been in a really dim, low light of your house, it cannot go straight from one extreme to the other. You have to harden it off just like you would other plants, put it in the shade, and then just gradually move it. So maybe you put it in partial shade and you still got some scorched leaves. It just maybe you didn't do it slowly enough. That's fine. It's not going to necessarily kill your plant. Might have some white patch surrounded by a dark ring or some several small spots. Just the area is small, leave it alone. If it's large, you can remove the entire leaf. If the area is mushy, it's a sign that it needs to be removed immediately before infecting the rest of the plant. So a mushy leaf, definitely cut it off and get it out of there. I actually have one of my orchids that the leaf got too much sun. It was just turned in this one certain way that the one leaf got the sun, and it actually ended up with a hole in the center of the leaf. So it first became really, like yellow and brittle, and then I was able to kind of poke it out just like a dry leaf, and that was all it did. The rest of the orchid is still healthy and thriving. Fortunately, it was just a minor hiccup. Orchid problem number four. My orchid's roots look very dry and black. What should I do? So overwatering can be a cause of this. Reduce the watering, remove any black, mushy, or otherwise damaged roots with sterile scissors. Even though they want moisture, they don't want to be sitting in water and susceptible to root rot, just like any other plant. So it could be a lack of humidity. Increase that humidity with a Wardian case, a terrarium, a pebble-lined tray, or a plant cabinet, and then remove any of those black, mushy, or otherwise damaged roots. If it's got fungus or black rot, remove that orchid from its pot and use sterile scissors to remove all the damaged roots. So you want all of those damaged fungusy black rot roots gone, just all of them. Get rid of them. You want completely fresh orchid potting medium, and you want to sterilize your pot. So it's going to be in a completely brand new setup when you're done with it. And then once you've got it repotted, and you want to give it its best go, its best shot, make sure it has proper air circulation, because too much humidity without air circulation, as we all know, can cause fungus, mold, and all kinds of unpleasant things just for ourselves. It also is not appreciated by your orchid. Okay, orchid issue number 5. Why can't I water my orchids with ice? Well, the long and short of it is orchids are tropical plants. They're sensitive to cold, and the ice temperatures can make an orchid more susceptible to infection. So it doesn't mean that your orchid's going to instantly die. My mom received an orchid one time. It was specifically sold as an ice water, like I think a just add ice orchid. And she did that, and it was happy for a long time until it wasn't. You have to be very careful about it because ice cubes deliver inconsistent irrigation. You're not getting the same amount of water each time. You may not be putting the ice cubes in the right spot. So if you're putting those ice cubes right on the crown of that plant, that's going to be much more likely to damage them than if you're putting them kind of away from the crown, keeping the crown protected from that extreme cold. So it's a if you want to try this, if you want to do it because you got a just add ice orchid, that's your choice. It's going to be a little more complicated, is all I'm telling you. It's your orchid is more susceptible to failure. It's really more of a gimmick to try to sell orchids as an easy care plant, and orchids can be very easy care depending on your variety. You just trust me, watering them is not that big of an issue. Okay. And then when it comes to troubleshooting orchid problems, of course, we love when people call us at Extension with plant questions and problems. Something else I found, though, too, that's really, really interesting and really helpful is the American Orchid Society online has an orchid troubleshooter. So I learned a lot just by going to that troubleshooter. It's got a little search engine where you can type in what's going on, and it will bring up all kinds of different possible solutions and issues that you may be having. So before we go further, Lisa, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yeah, there are a couple.
Okay, I can probably.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just look up here. Let's see. All right. Okay, better to spray the plants with spray bottle or pour water slowly on the plants? That's a question from Chip Boise. Thank you for the question. I prefer to water them slowly. I like to just use the little sprayer in my sink, honestly. Put it on like a low setting. I don't blast them and make the potting media go flying everywhere, but just give it a nice spray, just like you can imagine a little rainfall. Spraying the plants is something I like to do when I'm fertilizing. I find that I get good coverage for that, but I'm not going to get great coverage of every part of those roots and every part of the leaves with water if I'm just spraying and it's in a pot. Okay, thank you, Crystal, for the comment. Okay, I had heard to set your orchid roots in water for 15 minutes, then drain. Is that also an acceptable watering method? So it really depends on the type of orchid you have. I know for my Vanda orchid, since it loves humidity and moisture so much, I will fill up a sink of water and set my Vanda in there and wait until the roots turn like a dark green, like they're supposed to be, and then I'll take them out. And sometimes that's 10 minutes or a little bit more. Not all orchids really need that intense of a soak. You don't want to overdo it. So just kind of pay attention to how the roots look. If they're getting a nice juicy green looking, I call them juicy. If they're getting a nice juicy green looking, then it should be good. You don't want to leave them just sitting in there and allow them to become over wet to the point where you're inviting some fungus. And then should you water the flowers as well? No, it's not necessary to water the flowers. I rinse over them sometimes just because, they tend to flower for a couple of months and then I get the dust off that way. but they don't need to receive water just to live, no. And then when should I cut back the flower? The flower stem. You cut back the flower stem, Diane, whenever it starts to wilt. So you can just cut it all the way back, and it's going to grow a new stem whenever it decides to flower again. So I believe that's, unless I missed any of the questions, those are all the ones I saw. I wanted to let you know that our next Houseplant Academy will be both in person and online. So I do prefer to do these where I can have a hands-on component. The next one will be November 6th, The Art of Bonsai, and we'll be meeting at our the conference room on the second floor of the tag office building. But of course, you can always just, join in virtually and we will see you there as well. And do we have any more questions or anything before we close out?
So this was recorded. It's Lisa.
Mhm.
And if you came in after the start and you want to check out what Nicole's got to say on the first part, this should be up probably by next week, I would imagine. That was all.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then a question from Peggy. Should you use moss on top of the orchid bark? You don't have to. A lot of people like to do this to make it look nicer. You may find that it holds moisture in more. Most of the time, it's just an ornamental factor. You just kind of do it for the looks of it. So it's really your own choice. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you guys for tuning in. Will there be an email regarding the bonsai class? Well, for those of you who have signed up for the bonsai class, you'll get an email from me with the link. If you want to register, just go online to our UGA Gwinnett extension website, and it'll have you email our front desk person, Laura Tierney, and she will register you. Or you could always just email me if that's easier as well. I'll put my email address here in the chat. Yeah, and Lisa put a link there. Lisa put a link in the chat for you to go and register, and then there's
Yeah.
my email as well. So either way, it's free, whether you come in person or whether you watch online. Okay.
Also, I put the link for the um, YouTube channel. So, and I think you accidentally sent it just to me, so I'm going to put your email
Did I?
in
Oh, thank
the
you.
group chat. There we go.
Thank
So
you.
now everybody can get it. So,
Thank goodness for Lisa. She is my guru of everything horticulture and IT. So I could definitely not do these presentations without her help. All right. Well, I hope I can see or hear all of you on the next presentation on the 6th. And with that, I will see you later. Thank you for joining.